Hi there, Grade 12s. Welcome back. So in our last session, we spoke about the eye, the structure, the function of the different parts of the eye. We spoke about how all these different parts and structures work together, and we spoke about binocular vision, accommodation, and we also spoke about pupillary reflex, and then we discussed some different defects of the eye, such as short-sightedness, long-sightedness, and astigmatism. Now we're going to have a look at some different questions that you would expect to find in future tests and exams. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into things. The first slide asks the question. This diagram shows a longitudinal, in other words, sideways section through the human eye. Study the diagram and answer the questions that follow. So, this slide here, we have two different questions about the diagram alongside. This diagram shows a longitudinal or sideways section through an eye. We can see we have labels 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The first question says label parts 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now we had a diagram in our last session, so let's see. Can you figure out what part 2 is? Okay, hopefully you said this was the cornea. What about part number 3? Right, that was the lens. Part number 4 is the suspensory ligament. And finally, part number 5 is the iris. Okay, guys, you might have said it was circular muscle, or you might have said that it was ciliary muscle. In all likelihood, you'll get the marks for that as well. Question number 2 then says, name and describe the process that causes part 1 to dilate. And dilate just means to become wider. So the first thing we need to look at is we look at that diagram and we say, okay, what is part 1? Hopefully you guys will remember that part 1 is the pupil. Okay, so what is the process that causes that pupil to get wider? Okay, and then after that, we need to discuss this process. What do we call this process? It is pupillary action or pupillary reflex. How do we then go about describing it? Well, we say that when conditions are darker, the pupil, part 1, will dilate. This happens when the suspensory muscles, or the ciliary muscles rather, in the iris contract, and the circular muscles in the iris relax. The relaxing of the circular muscles and contraction of the ciliary muscles allows the pupil to increase in size or to dilate, and this then allows more light to enter the eye. So that is the process that we need to describe. Let's now head on to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide then says, this figure, as you can see there, shows a longitudinal section through the human eye. The structures which enable the eye to focus on objects are missing in this diagram. Okay, so we have an eye here, but they've left out part of the diagram which shows the changes in the lenses and etc. when we are focusing on a distant object or a near object. So in all likelihood, this question has to do with the process of accommodation. So the question then says, study the diagram and answer the questions that follow. Draw a longitudinal section through the missing parts to indicate the appearance of these structures when you are 1. Reading a book. Okay, guys, so what we're doing here is we are redrawing just the parts that's missing in that diagram, and we have to draw what those parts are going to look like when they are focused on something that is close to us. Remember, we are doing scientific diagrams, so you can label them and add notes. So, if we're going to draw this, we need to remember what parts do we need to draw. We're talking about accommodation. What are the parts important to accommodation? Well, we have the lens, the suspensory ligaments, and the muscles of the iris, or rather the ciliary muscles. Okay, so we have a look there and we see we'll draw something similar to what you see next to me here. We'll have the ciliary muscle, we'll have the suspensory ligaments, and we'll have the lens. Now, important things to make sure you draw correctly, and you can even mention in your labels, is that the ciliary muscles have contracted, that the suspensory ligaments have slackened, and the lens is more convex. So make sure you include those things when you draw this picture. The next one then, we are asked, what about if we had to draw this again? But this time we are looking at an object that is more than 6 meters away. Well, again, we're going to need to include the same structures, the lens, the ciliary muscles, and the suspensory ligaments. But this time it's going to look a bit different. As you can see in this diagram, the ciliary muscles must be relaxed. The suspensory ligaments must be tighter or taut, and the lens must be less convex. In other words, it must be flatter. So this is what it looks like when you're looking at an object that is further away. Okay, now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, in this third slide, guys, you can see we have yet another diagram showing the eye, or at least part of the eye. Questions and tests and exams will often use diagrams when they talk about the eye and the ear, which we'll cover in the next lesson. So there we have that diagram. The first question says, list and name the structures that are used during the process of accommodation. So let's go through each one of those structures one at a time. Structure 1 is the cornea. We know that the cornea is not used during accommodation. 2 then is likely to be the suspensory ligaments, which we know is used during accommodation. Structure number 3 would be the lens. Number 4 then is the pupil. Number 5 is the fluid found between the lens and the cornea, and this is called the vitreous, or rather the aqueous humor. And then finally we have number 6, which is pointing to the muscles of the eye, which are known as the iris. So, which of those structures that we've just talked about are involved with the process of accommodation? So you would have said number 2, the suspensory ligament. Number 3, the lens. And actually that's it. We've only got the 2 structures here. Unless, of course, you said that number 6 was the ciliary muscle. You could have said it was the iris, but you could have also said it was the ciliary muscle. In which case your answer would be 2, the suspensory ligaments, 3, the lens, and 6, the ciliary muscle. These are all used during the process of accommodation. Number 2 then says, describe the path light and impulses take from an object to where it is interpreted by the brain. Okay, so we need to think now. We have an object that we are looking at. The light travels from the object through the air and it enters the eye through the cornea. It then travels through the cornea, through the aqueous humor, into the pupil. The light then travels from the pupil into the lens, where it is refracted. The lens refracts the light so that as the light travels through the vitreous humor, it will reach the retina and form a nice focused image. The retina is full of cones and rods which are specialized photoreceptor cells. These photoreceptor cells turn the light information into nerve impulses, which are then sent via the optic nerve to the brain. Okay, so that's the path. To summarize again, light from the object through the air passes through the cornea, through the aqueous humor, then through the pupil into the lens. From the lens, the light goes through the vitreous humor and arrives on the retina. The retina contains rod cells and cone cells which turn this information into nerve impulses which travel via the optic nerve to the brain. Okay guys, that's it for today's lesson. Thank you for joining me. Now remember, if you want more worksheets or you want to revise any of this work, you can find all of this on the iWiz website at www.iwiz.co.za. Feel free to go into the site and make use of all the free resources there. Anyway, I hope you guys are working hard as we draw closer to the exams. I'll see you all soon in our next lesson.